New Orleans Saints running back Alvin Kamara is exactly what the Saints need, not just on the field, but off. We got all that and a little bit of lagniappe for you on today's episode of Locked On Saints.
You are Locked On Saints, your daily New Orleans Saints podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What is good, Who Dat Nation and Who Dat family? Welcome into another episode of Locked On Saints, your daily podcast covering your favorite team, the New Orleans Saints, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Thanks so much as always, making Locked On Saints your first listen of the day every day. Don't forget that we're free and available across all podcast apps and on YouTube as well. And I'm your host, Ross Jackson, at Ross Jackson Nola on Twitter, your New Orleans Saints expert credential member of the media, CrescentCitySports.com, USA Today's Saints Wire, Tuesdays Locked On NFL, and here with you every single Monday through Friday of Locked On Saints. And today's episode of Locked On Saints is brought to you by our friends over at Bet Online. They've got more odds, lines, and props than ever before. Go and check them out, Bet Online, where the game starts. On today's episode, Dennis Allen does his day after conference call. You'd be surprised about some of the things that he had to say about how the Saints are going to move forward. Are there coaches in New Orleans on the hot seat? We'll answer that question. But first, I want to speak on Alvin Kamara addressing the team after the Saints' disappointing loss to the Arizona Cardinals on Thursday Night Football, because Alvin Kamara is exactly what the New Orleans Saints need, not just on the field, but off the field as well. Now, thankfully for the New Orleans Saints, Alvin Kamara is pretty locked in, so there's not going to be any point at which I think you're going to have to worry about Alvin Kamara demanding a trade or being moved. I know that there's been a lot of conversation about all of that since Christian McCaffrey was moved yesterday from the Carolina Panthers to the San Francisco 49ers, but that's an entirely different situation there over in Carolina, to where they are effectively blowing things up and starting over, which almost never works, at least not in the short term, right? It's a long-term plan that Carolina is about to undergo, and that's fine. That's not really where the New Orleans Saints are. That's not really ever been the New Orleans Saints MO. If they were going to do that, they would have done that a couple years ago, not now where they're $50 million over the cap with an aging roster, right? It's too late for that kind of a thing. So for that situation, that don't look at the Carolina Panthers situation and say, that's what the New Orleans Saints are going to be doing, because they're not going to do that anytime soon. This is a New Orleans Saints team that continues to be intent on competing, whether playoffs are 5.6% in their favor or 95.6% in their favor. They're going to keep playing. And a person like Alvin Kamara is the reason why the Saints are going to be able to continue to do that. I'm not here to tell you that the New Orleans Saints are about to turn their season around or anything like that. Like I said in last night's postcast, I will believe that when I see that. But when it comes to what Alvin Kamara brings to this team, he's exactly what the New Orleans Saints need. A lot's been made of this kind of like calming presence that Andy Dalton has reportedly brought to the locker room. And to an extent, there's value in that. But right now, potentially, that's not necessarily what you're looking for, right? Maybe it's not the calming presence anymore. Maybe you need the fire. Maybe you need the sense of urgency. And that's why what Alvin Kamara did after the game is so important. Alvin Kamara addressed the team, basically telling them that the way that they're playing right now, in the way that they're losing right now, having a losing mentality, that it's simply not Saints football, demanded accountability of himself and demanded accountability of the players around him as well. And that's really something that's kind of out of the ordinary when you think about Alvin Kamara's leadership style. Now, don't forget, he's a captain this year, right? And this is exactly what the captains should be doing. I've seen some folks saying things about like, hey, well, the players shouldn't have to do that. No, the players are always going to do something like this. That's the point of having captains, right? So when you look at what Alvin Kamara is doing in terms of the fact that he is the guy that did it, knowing that he's kind of usually the strong, quiet type, that he's kind of the lead by example type, the fact that he came out and vocalized frustration, and maybe not frustration, but vocalized at least a demand for better play from the team, is meaningful, big time meaningful, right? Like, imagine the person around you, and maybe that's like a family member of yours or a friend of yours, something like that, that like never gets mad, that never gets angry. And then all of a sudden they do, right? Something happens and they do get angry. That kind of hits different, doesn't it? Like, a lot of people tell me all the time, like, Ross is super nice, like he's a really kind guy, but I don't want to be on his bad side because like if he's mad at you, he's really mad at you. And that's facts. And so when you look at Alvin Kamara, this is a little bit into my personality at that point. But when you look at Alvin Kamara, like the only person I would be more surprised pleasantly surprised at being the player that comes out and demands more from the rest of the players that's kind of in that position and has that stature within the organization would be like Taysom Hill. I can't imagine Taysom Hill being angry like ever. And so when you have guys like that, like Alvin Kamara, who is out there smiling, shining all the time and everything, to have him be the one that steps forward and says, hey, we got to be better than this. Like, that's meaningful. That means something. So Alvin Kamara, not only what the Saints need on the field, and trust me, the Saints need to get this right because Alvin Kamara through 7 games has 0 touchdowns, and that's simply inexcusable. And he got some touches in the red zone last week, just the blocking wasn't there for him, things like that. But I think there's more creative ways that the Saints have used him in the past, in the passing game, in the screen game, dump offs, having him run those angle routes, those Texas routes, those option routes that we just don't see from Alvin Kamara for some reason. And that's not on Alvin Kamara. That's a play calling thing, right? We used to see that in the red zone all the time, and it always worked. You know why? Because Alvin Kamara is really freaking good. And so when he made that option choice, he would often make the right choice. And he and Drew Brees saw the field the same way. You're not necessarily going to get that kind of chemistry from Alvin Kamara and Andy Dalton. You're not necessarily going to get that kind of chemistry from Alvin Kamara and Jameis Winston either, but at least we've seen it happen with them because Jameis Winston is one of the best like red zone quarterbacks over the course of the last little bit. Not that I think any quarterback on the roster for the Saints is the answer for the long term at this point, but you got to find somebody. You got to go with what works, and that's something we've seen work before. Andy Dalton in the red zone is not what we have seen work, particularly over the course of the past couple of weeks. So when you look at Alvin Kamara, he's giving you exactly what you need off the field in terms of being the leader. I mean, Traquan Smith said that's the first time that any player has come forth and addressed the team, quote, in that manner, per Cat Terrell over at ESPN. That's meaningful when he does something like that. Now, you know he's what you need on the field. You got to do a better job at getting the ball in his hands in a bunch of different situations and utilizing him the way that we've seen Alvin Kamara utilized in the past, which is very versatile, very multiple, not just a couple of handoffs and a couple of passes here and there to the flats. It's got to be more than that. You have to game plan with this guy. So Alvin Kamara is what you need off the field. He's also what you need to get going on the field if you are the New Orleans Saints. And who does that responsibility lie upon? Is that Alvin Kamara? Is that Andy Dalton? Or is that one of the coaches? And are these coaches all of a sudden 2-7 through the first 7 games with a roster like they have that's, yes, dealing with some injuries and some health concerns, but still, even when those players were on the field, there were some question marks. Are these coaches now on the hot seat just 7 weeks into the season? I'll tell you why or why not as we continue on with today's episode of Locked On Saints. Before we get to that, though, I'm going to tell you about our friends over at Simply Safe. I absolutely love Simply Safe. It's been awesome. They have these kind of like next level security, home security systems that don't require somebody to come in and do wiring all over your apartment or your home or whatever. You can just set it all up on your own. It's super, super easy. Now they're going to be offering Locked On Saints listeners a huge deal here. So I'm going to be telling you about that here in just a moment. The best home security in 2022, according to US News. They love it. I love it. You're going to love it as well, because at Simply Safe, your safety is the only thing that matters. I have a Simply Safe full setup over here. They sent it. It was like a box of like 30 different pieces and everything that included glass break detection, hazard sensors, door sensors, window sensors, exterior keypads, exterior cameras, and then your home base station. Whole bunch of stuff like that just gets you completely covered by their 24/7 monitoring agents over at Simply Safe, as well as their support tech staff, which is awesome as well. So if you want to check out Simply Safe, and I highly recommend you do, don't miss this chance to save big when it comes to protecting your home. You can now get 40% off of your order when you visit simplysafe.com/lockedonnfl today. Customize the perfect system for your home in just a few minutes. Once again, that is simplysafe.com. That's simply with an I instead of a Y /lockedonnfl. Go today. There's no safe like Simply Safe. All right, family, continuing on with today's episode of Locked On Saints. Thanks again so much for making Locked On Saints your first listen of the day every day. Don't forget to go and check out NFL Key Predictions, which drops on the Locked On NFL podcast, as well as Locked On NFL YouTube page today. 5 biggest games of the weekend, including Sunday, Monday Night Football, with the local experts giving you everything you need to know, and the betting advice from the industry leaders over at BetOnline. Once again, that's NFL Key Predictions over at the Locked On NFL YouTube page and podcast as well. All right. The New Orleans Saints coaches are on the hot seat, yes or no? So we're going to run through our kind of list here of maybe the 4 or 5 biggest names in terms of coordinators, things like that, about whether or not they're on the hot seat. Let's start off with the biggest name here, Dennis Allen. Is Dennis Allen on the hot seat? It depends on how you define hot seat, right? Coaches don't usually get fired in the middle of their first season. That doesn't often happen. I think the last time we saw Steve Wilkes was after the season. So really the last time we saw it was Urban Meyer, but that's an entirely different situation that we saw there. So it's been a while since you really see first year head coaches let go during the season. So I highly doubt that happens. But in terms of his retention beyond this season, things are starting to heat up for him a little bit. I don't think that that's unfair to say, but I also don't think that the Saints are in a hurry to move on from Dennis Allen. They really like continuity. I'll explain why that might actually be a problem in the next in our next conversation, but they really like continuity. And so I think that maybe they would give Dennis Allen another year after this, but I don't know. I mean, it kind of depends. Like if he doesn't win another game for the rest of the season, it's going to be a little tough to justify retaining that coaching. You know what I mean? And so like that becomes the big question mark is how does the rest of the season play out? But I don't expect anything to happen during the regular season. That seems far-fetched. And that's well beyond what usually happens within the NFL. That kind of shines a bad light on the organization too, by not giving them that full time, committing to them for the full season, all of that. So not necessarily a situation that you want to color yourself with when you could potentially be, I guess John Gruden was also let go in the middle of the season. But again, very, very different situation. He resigned, right? So I think that, and for purposes that are not a part of this situation, let me just say it that way. So I think in the middle, when you're talking about the middle of the season, you want to cast a nice light on yourself when you have a coaching opening, not that you're cutthroat and that you'll move on from your new head coach if they're failing or if they're struggling partway through the season and all of that. Now, coordinators, the leash might be a little bit shorter, a little bit shorter on. You can change coordinators, things like that. But that gets us to like our next 4 names of Pete Carmichael, the offensive coordinator, your co-defensive coordinators, Ryan Nielsen and Chris Richard, as well as your special teams coordinator and Darren Rizzi. Let me say, first of all, I don't think Darren Rizzi is going anywhere anytime soon unless he gets a better opportunity somewhere else over the course of the offseason. He's one of the NFL's brightest special teams coordinators. And I know the special teams unit hasn't been great all season, but with the exception of a shanked punt a week ago, the special teams unit is the one unit that I feel like has gotten better each week, right? Return game got a little bit better when Taysom Hill took over. Rashid Shaheed had a nice one yesterday. Not a lot of opportunities in the return game though, with touchbacks touchbacks in that and not forcing any punts over on the defensive side, right? Defense has been on a decline throughout the season based upon what the expectations were at the beginning of the season, based upon the production over the first 2 seasons, right? Now they've dealt with injury. Marcus Bay's been out. Marshon Lattimore has been out. Everyone got hurt yesterday. So there's some things to consider there, but all in all, there's been a little bit of a decline there. So here's what I would say about Chris Richard and Ryan Nielsen. I don't think either of them are on the hot seat, but I wonder if maybe the co-defensive coordinator experiment does not continue into 2023, and if they go back to a sole defensive coordinator. Let's face it, if Sean Payton gets a new head coaching job next year, one of those guys is going with Sean, right? Sean's going to take him. There's no way that particularly Ryan Nielsen potentially, and then giving him that assistant head coach thing, but also Ryan Nielsen could be in consideration for a head coaching job as well. He's had that conversation before. When you speak to him, I've spoken to him in the press conferences and stuff like that, the guy feels like a head coach. It feels like you're talking to a head coach. So there's something there as well that like he might have a bigger opportunity elsewhere. And then so the co-defensive coordinator thing doesn't carry on beyond this season, not necessarily at the detriment of one of the coaches, but because of the trajectory of one of the coaches. Pete Carmichael, on the other hand, moving on from a play caller in the middle of the season, you're effectively punting the season at that point. Like that very rarely works out for a team, changing play callers and stuff like that. So I don't know that anything happens to him in the middle of the season. But remember, Pete Carmichael was originally not going to be retained as the offensive coordinator. He was going to be he was going to be still with the team, but in a different role, or maybe an advisory role, maybe an analytics role, maybe something like that, right? I don't know what it was going to be, but a different role. So now you've been setting up and building this trajectory for Ronald Curry over the course of the past few seasons. Does Ronald Curry become your next offensive coordinator because you love continuity so much, or do you really go somewhere else? Here's my biggest question around offensive coordinator. No matter what you do at head coach, your offensive coordinator needs to be somebody that's kind of a quarterback whisperer. That's what we've seen in the NFL, and it's what we've seen work in the NFL over the course of the past few seasons. So either the head coach or the offensive coordinator is usually that kind of quarterback whisperer. After this season, it's very likely that the Saints will be in a situation where they're looking to draft and develop a quarterback, which is something we haven't really seen work in the NFL. You think about in New Orleans. You think about since 2006, Drew Brees was a free agent, right? They never really developed Aaron Brooks. They never really developed, any of those guys that were ahead of that. It was, really like who was really the last good quarterback that the Saints drafted and developed? Was it Archie? Right. So beyond that, I don't know really that there's any example of the Saints drafting and developing a quarterback. Right. So you look at Drew Brees, free agent. Teddy Bridgewater, free agent. Taysom Hill, undrafted free agent that they brought over, not really in a situation to where he's developed into something else, hasn't really developed into a quarterback. Andy Dalton, free agent. Jameis Winston, free agent. They drafted Ian Book. He's now in Philadelphia. He got picked up by Philadelphia. They drafted Garrett Grayson years ago. That never really panned out. They drafted Tommy Stevens and tried to turn him into a tight end, and then he ended up leaving, and now I don't even think he's in the NFL anymore. So if you're going to go somewhere else at offensive coordinator, I think it's important to go with a sort of quarterback mind, a quarterback whisperer, which Ronald Curry falls under that category, right? So that will be something that will be interesting to watch moving forward. Not this season, but after the season, where they go at offensive coordinator moving forward, right? They have a lot of belief in Ronald Curry. The NFL has a lot of belief in Ronald Curry, if I'm being honest with you. So somebody's got to give him the opportunity, and it's either going to be in New Orleans or it's going to potentially be elsewhere. So could we already be looking at the next offensive coordinator for the New Orleans Saints on their staff? Or do they finally go the far venture outside of the organization and bring in an offensive coordinator that has proven success in the NFL already? They could go either route. I wouldn't blame them for either one, if I'm being perfectly honest, because I have a lot of belief in Ronald Curry. But if they went outside of the organization, that also makes sense. So that's the way that I look at it in terms of like quote unquote hot seats for coordinators and coaches for the New Orleans Saints. I think Dennis Allen has a seat that is sort of heating up, but doesn't really mean anything for this season. I think he's going to be given the opportunity. And honestly, truly, I think he deserves the opportunity to try to turn things around. And then if he can't, then you reevaluate after the season. And then maybe you give him the opportunity to start with his own, coach or something, or his own quarterback or something like that. And then in his second year, if it's not working partway through, then you can move on from him halfway through the season or during the midpoint of the season without casting the bad light there. The question is, what happens at defensive coordinator at that point and all that? So there's a lot of complications around the idea of moving on from any of these coaches during the season. Doesn't mean that it won't happen depending upon how bad things get, but seems unlikely. And speaking of Dennis Allen, we had a conference call with him earlier today, had some interesting thoughts on how it is that the New Orleans Saints approach things moving forward. We'll break that down, but I'm going to kind of give you a little bit of a nugget here in terms of what I think. I think the New Orleans Saints, this idea of continuity, it's not working. Maybe changing the identity is better than trying to reinstate identity. I'll explain what I mean as we continue on to wrap up today's episode of Locked On Saints. Before we get to that, I want to tell you about our friends over at Bet Online. Mentioned them earlier, but let me tell you a little bit more. So if you're somebody that loves sports wagering, and that could be because you like to participate in it, or maybe you use it as a advanced analytic, maybe things like that, like how teams perform against the spread and everything. If you want all of that news analysis as well as opportunities to get involved in the action, BetOnline is the place. BetOnline is the place that you need to go. They're your number one source for all sports wagering information. So whether you're wanting to get in on the odds, whether you're wanting to learn more about the odds, lines, props, things like that, whether you're just looking to figure out like how the experts are projecting a player's performance, and then that impacts how you do things with your fantasy team in the NBA, stuff like that. So much for you to get in on. Or maybe you just want to get in on the Pelicans game tonight. So they take on the Charlotte Hornets. They're favored massively in that matchup. You like that? I think you should. They scored 130 points on a vastly superior team. So just something to consider. Anyway, you can go find all of that with the leading experts in the industry over at BetOnline, where the game starts. Let's get it, Who Dat Nation. Wrapping up today's episode of Locked On Saints in a way that might surprise you a little bit in terms of how the New Orleans Saints are approaching this kind of mini bye. So I'm recording this last bit of the show right after Dennis Allen's press conference, or rather conference call, which isn't televised or like aired on the website or anything like that. So I wanted to make sure that I brought you thoughts from it. And one of the things that was really like most surprising to me in this was you have a 2-5 team. Let me not make it worse than it really is. I apologize. I'm so sorry. 2-5 team right now through the first 7 games. And things just haven't been working. And I have a theory of why that's the case. I'm going to tell you that theory here in just a second. But the thing for me is this approach that the New Orleans Saints are taking moving forward. So Dennis Allen said that he's giving the team the weekend off. Basically, they'll be back at the facility on Monday, which is granted more time than they would usually spend there. I mean, like the majority of practice happens Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. So if that means an extra practice day or something like that, they're still doing more work coming off of a disappointing first 7 games of the season to, try to improve before the 8th game against the Raiders at home. So I don't want to dismiss that, and I don't want to diminish that, but it does feel a little bit like time off and time away when you have concerns around intensity over the past couple of games, when Alvin Kamara is challenging the players in the locker room, that you'd want to build on that momentum. I understand the 24-hour rule and taking 24 hours after the game off and everything like that, but maybe maximizing the practice time, maximizing the time with the players together, all working towards this common goal of improving this team before their next game. Maybe that's really the route to go. So I'm a little bit surprised to hear that. Here's my caveat though. If this becomes like a thing at the end of the season that we learn that over the course of this weekend, the New Orleans Saints coaches slept at the facility, got it all fixed, got it all right, and all of a sudden the Saints took off after this weekend because of the work that the coaches did away from the players and then brought to the players with the extra practice day on Monday, depending upon how they manage Tuesday. I'm cloudy on the CBA rules on practice and like when they have to have a day off and things like that at the moment. But that's neither here nor there. Do you have the extra time? Yes. And how are you utilizing it, or are you not utilizing it? Right. And there's no such thing as not utilizing it. Someone somewhere, Dennis Allen, is going to be doing some work. You know what I mean? And so his goal here over the course of the next little bit is to work on identifying the things that need to improve from the first 7 games. The issue is that it feels like over the course of the first 7 games, the same things have been the issue. Penalties at bad times on the offense reared their ugly heads again, like the penalties being the ugly heads, not the people. But the penalties reared their ugly heads again in the Thursday night game. Lack of turning the ball over, knack for turning the ball over on the offensive side, lack of tackling on the defensive side. The Saints missed like 4 tackles on one play on Eno Benjamin, the 3rd string running back, right? So these are all things that have needed to be fixed since week 1 and haven't been fixed yet. So are they going to be fixed by not working the team more? I don't know. So whatever magic formula happens over the course of the next 3 days, it's going to be without the players. And then the players will show up on Monday and hopefully take the magic formula and everything's going to be fine. And maybe the magic formula is health, right? Maybe the magic for the Saints back half of the season, kind of like the Miami Dolphins had last season, is that the roster gets healthy. You get Michael Thomas and Jarvis Landry back. But even still, there are quintessential things in terms of what the New Orleans Saints play calling has looked like, their utilization or lack thereof of playmakers. Taysom Hill just sitting on the sideline in the second half. Alvin Kamara hardly getting any usage. Like these things, or hardly getting usage in the way that we're accustomed to seeing it. Like I mentioned, like those angle routes, those option routes, like we're not seeing that. Either we're not seeing it hit or we're not seeing it called throughout this season. So there are still things that, like, you could have the best talent that you need on the field, but if you can't maximize them, then they can't be maximized. Like it's just that simple. So the health does end up being a portion of the factor, but it's not a large enough piece of the factor. You still have to utilize this talent. So here's my theory on why things are going wrong. I think that the New Orleans Saints idea of maintaining their identity from previous years isn't working. Shocker, Ross, #analysis. But let me explain what I mean. This team either has to fully buy into what used to be the system in New Orleans or change it entirely. I don't think that this idea of taking the playbook that's existed before and making like tiny adjustments to it is going to work. It has to be one or the other. I think that goes for the offensive side. And the Saints, look, they moved the ball fine yesterday. They just had the interceptions, which isn't a just, right? You can't just excuse that. Say, oh, well, if we didn't throw 2 pick sixes, then that's not how football works. So I think that that's one thing. But I think that that might exist on the defensive side too, because the defense as a whole is the same as what it was last year. You have the same play caller. You have the same coaches all over the place. There's not really any big shifts over on the defensive side, aside from the two safety positions. But the big passes downfield haven't really been an issue when Tyrann Mathieu and Marcus May are both healthy. It's been the tackling, it's been the catch and run situations. And we've seen the New Orleans Saints deal with this issue before. So if there is something going on that's not putting those players in the best position, then you have to change it. Something has to change. The thing that made Sean Payton so special, and I know that like for the New Orleans Saints, comparing Dennis Allen and Sean Payton isn't what they want to do. And I know that like for you as a listener or as a viewer, comparing the two of them is like apples and oranges, right? You're talking about a defensive head coach, you're talking about an offensive head coach. You're talking about two very good minds, but in their own category, which is why they work so extremely well together. But one of the things that made Sean Payton so special was his ability to change everything, to innovate, whether that be smaller nuances or wide swathing changes. He completely redesigned the New Orleans Saints offense on multiple occasions, right? Not the least of which being the one that's probably most evident, which was retooling the offense to be a more condensed one and to still produce with Drew Brees and the declining arm strength, where he wasn't pushing the ball down the field the way that he was in 2014, 15, 16, right? But then even before that, 2011, before that, like the offense was different. Then all of a sudden, 2011 through 2017, the offense became a big play offense, right? A bigger play offense, right? So those are my things, right? Either be the same if you want to maintain continuity, or change everything, or make wider swathing changes as opposed to small nuances. And maybe that's what we see from the New Orleans Saints after this weekend. Maybe that's the point of giving the players off over the course of the weekend so that they can work on retooling some of those things. But Dennis Allen clearly said that like they're going to look at everything, but they're not sure that play calling is going to change. I'm interested in that comment. He said it specifically about the defensive side. Does what he means by that mean, or is what he means by that the play calling rhythm and cadence isn't going to change? Or does it mean that the play caller isn't going to change? Because the play caller doesn't have to change for the defensive play calling to change. Does that make sense? So I'm curious about what that comment actually means. So we'll see. We'll see. But it's a little surprising to hear how the New Orleans Saints are going to be moving forward. But hey, let's see how it all works out. Coming up on Monday, we're going to break everything down from this game a little bit further. We're going to kind of get back on our rhythm. I know the Thursday game kind of throws off the recap, analytics Tuesday, film watch Wednesday, all of that stuff. But we'll still dig into this game a little bit more. There were some positive performances, including cornerback Alontae Taylor, guard Cesar Ruiz is taking some massive steps forward. So we'll celebrate some of the good things that happened from this game, but also talk about what went wrong. So we'll break all that down even further on Monday, get into analytics on Tuesday. Wednesday, we've got film watch, all that good stuff. And then we're on to the Raiders after that. So I appreciate y'all as always for making Locked On Saints your first listen of the day every day. Don't forget to also go and check out for your second listen today, the Locked On Sports Today podcast. Get all of the sporting news that you need from around the entire sporting world in less than 22 minutes. Peter Bukowski, great job over at Locked On Sports Today. So go and check that out. Appreciate you as always, making Locked On Saints a part of your day, a part of your routine, for saying yes to me and the show. As always, if you see me, say hi. And of course, if you need anything else around your New Orleans Saints in between these episodes, make sure you follow me on Twitter at Ross Jackson, NOLA. Hit me up. Learn how the family's doing. Let me know how you living. Let me know how you mom and them. And trust Who Dat Nation. I'll holla at you.